Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. In the quaint town of Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, Kimberly Cates and her family believed they had found a sanctuary from the dangers of the world. But one fateful night shattered that illusion as the brutality of the city crept into their home, leaving devastation in its wake. Amidst the chaos, 11-year-old Jamie's resilience and courage emerged as a beacon of hope in the face of unspeakable horror. As the community grappled with the aftermath, a chilling truth emerged about the perpetrators, revealing a darkness that lurked within the shadows of an idyllic town. Night of the Creeps. When pediatric nurse Kimberly Cates and her husband David relocated to the picturesque New England town of Mount Vernon, New Hampshire in 2003, the safety-conscious couple had wasted no time having an alarm system installed. With a young daughter to think about, they weren't taking any chances. After a year or so of peaceful living without fear of crime entering their lives, they relaxed and allowed themselves to believe that nothing bad ever happened in the little slice of heaven they now called home. In the early morning hours of October 4th, 2009, while David was away on business, the threat of violence the Cates family thought they had left behind in the big city found its way into their sanctuary with devastating results. At around 3 a.m., Kimberly had been awakened by a dim light shining in her face. Thinking that her daughter needed her, she had sat up in bed and asked, "Jamie, is that you?" Her query was met with a series of savage blows from a machete, 36 in all. She was also stabbed numerous times in the neck and torso by a second assailant. Alerted by her mother's screams, 11-year-old Jamie, who had been sound asleep in the same bed, bolted upright and attempted to run. Her progress was halted by a knife-wielding intruder who proceeded to stab her 18 times in the chest, arms, legs, and back. At one point, she had fallen into her attacker's arms, prompting him to throw her across the room into a glass door. Assuming that both of their victims were dead, the killers had spent the next few minutes looking for valuables. After pilfering several items of jewelry, they had fled into the night. When she was certain that the coast was clear, Jamie, who had lain perfectly still as the home invaders stepped over her lifeless form, crawled into the kitchen and dialed 911. After telling the dispatcher in a voice barely above a whisper that someone had killed her mother, she collapsed on the floor. At around 4 o'clock that morning, first responders arrived on the scene. The officer who found Jamie recalled that she had been covered in blood. Part of her left foot was missing, and she had suffered numerous injuries, including a fractured jaw and a deep laceration across her throat. Despite her grim condition, she was conscious and remarkably lucid. In the bedroom, paramedics discovered Kimberly's brutalized body. Upon confirming that she had not survived the excessively violent attack, a call was placed to the county coroner. An autopsy would show that the 36 blows Kimberly sustained had all but destroyed much of her body. Among other things, her skull had been split nearly in half. It was clear that whoever was behind the killing had acted without restraint, hacking away at the helpless woman in her own bed. The official determination held that though the injuries had done irreparable damage, none had been lethal. Rather, Kimberly had bled to death. It was surmised that she had likely been awake and aware of what was happening to her throughout much of the attack. As investigators were combing over the crime scene, across town, 17-year-old Stephen Spader and his toady 19-year-old Christopher Gribble showed up at the home of their mutual friend Autumn Savoy shortly before sunrise. After excitedly telling them that they had just killed 2 people, they asked for his help in getting rid of evidence. Not the least bit surprised by the admission, since he had been asked in advance to participate but had wisely declined, Savoy agreed to lend a hand. At 5:30 a.m., the trio gathered up the bloody clothing that had been worn during the killings, along with the stolen goods they decided weren't worth selling, and threw them into the Nashua River. Believing they were free and clear, Spader and Gribble had then retreated to their respective houses to catch a few hours of sleep. Upon waking, Gribble had headed to a pawn shop to unload Kimberly's gold jewelry. The entire lot had yielded a paltry $130, driving home the point that wanton killing had been the perpetrator's ultimate motive, rather than financial gain. Later that afternoon, the pair had paid a visit to the home of another friend, Kyle Fenton. As they bragged loudly about the double homicide they had pulled off without a hitch, they were unaware that their buddy's mother could hear every word. Knowing what she had to do, she promptly called police. As it turned out, Spader and Gribble had been making the rounds, boasting to their friends and acquaintances of the killings throughout the morning. Instead of being impressed, several of the stunned listeners had reported the admissions to authorities. Before the day was through, both Spader and Gribble were in custody. In addition to the two main players, their accomplices, William Marks, 18, and Quinn Glover, 17, were also picked up and brought in for questioning. The Killing Game. After being read his rights, Gribble was asked about his involvement in the murders in an interview that he was informed was being recorded. Seemingly unbothered by his current situation, the suspect had assured detectives that his knowledge of the crime was limited to what he had seen on the 6 o'clock news. Gribble, who was as cool as a cucumber throughout the hours-long interrogation, described himself as a gentleman whose chivalrousness would never allow him to harm a female. He went on to claim that he was appalled at the notion that anyone could inflict such violence upon anyone, especially an 11-year-old child. When he was informed that Jamie had survived and would be able to identify her assailant, he acted as if he were thrilled with the news. Even after learning that he was being implicated by his cohorts, Gribble refused to budge. Determined to walk away scot-free, he wasn't about to put a noose around his neck if there was any way around it. After repeatedly proclaiming his innocence, Gribble eventually shut down the interview. Following the letter of the law, detectives had turned off the tape recorder and left the room. The suspect, who made no attempt to leave, remained in the interrogation room, alone with his thoughts. A little while later, Gribble summoned one of the detectives with whom he had established a rapport back into the room. Seemingly out of curiosity, he had asked if the Cates killing would warrant the death penalty. The detective couldn't say for certain, but he indicated that the state of New Hampshire had stringent requirements for such an extreme sentence, and he didn't believe that this case would fall under that umbrella. Gribble had then inquired about the possible prison terms that would be handed down if the killers were found guilty. After pondering his options, he told the detective to turn the tape recorder back on. He was ready to reveal what he knew. Before proceeding, the investigators had made a point of having Gribble repeat his request to speak on record. He was also informed that his right to remain silent still applied. After affirming that he was acting of his own free will, he gave a detailed account of the events that had taken place less than 24 hours earlier. According to Gribble, his best friend, Stephen Spader, had masterminded the murders. In the days leading up to the actual crime, Spader and William Marks had scouted locations, searching for a secluded property with no neighbors close enough to hear the screams. They had found exactly what they were looking for at 4 Trow Road, the Cates residence. Gribble insisted that none of them knew who lived in the house and didn't care. Their plan was to kill everyone and to steal anything they thought they could sell for profit. Upon arriving at the house under cover of darkness, the group, which consisted of Gribble, Spader, Marks, and Glover, found the place locked up tight. Since Marks was small of stature and Reed thin, they decided that he would sneak in through a narrow basement window and let the others in by way of an upstairs door. Although he was successful in entering the dwelling, once inside, Marks discovered that he couldn't get out of the basement. Moving to Plan B, the others removed a window air conditioner and climbed in through the gaping space it had occupied. They had then unlocked the basement door, allowing Marks to join them. At that point, they had been on the property for over a half an hour. After disabling the lights via the breaker box, the quartet of home invaders had gone from room to room, using the lights from their cell phones as their guide. It was in the master bedroom that they found what they were looking for. As Spader and Gribble unleashed a frenzied attack on the defenseless mother and daughter, Marks watched from the doorway, taking in the carnage. Glover, unable to stomach the grisly scene, had retreated to the living room until it was over. Throughout his confession, Gribble had maintained an emotionless monotone, his voice betraying not a shred of regret or remorse. He had spoken of the gurgling sounds coming from Kimberly that had prompted him to stab her in the throat in the same manner as one would describe writing out a grocery list. He also lamented the fact that he hadn't made sure that Jamie was dead. He asserted that this wasn't because of his innate cruelty, but rather because he felt that it would have spared her the pain of going through life without a mother. The Disciples of Destruction. As Gribble was telling his version of events, Steven Spader was across the hall doing the same. While he too had started out protesting his innocence, after learning that his buddies were telling a much different story, he dropped the "who me" routine pretty quickly. Not one bit ashamed of his actions, he had told his story with a sense of accomplishment that only those who kill with ease are capable of understanding. When describing the events of the previous night, Spader recounted how the little girl had screamed and struggled with Gribble while he hacked up the mom. As it turned out, Spader had been a ticking time bomb since the moment he sprung from the womb of his drug-addled mother. Although he was adopted when he was 5 days old by a loving family who had given him the world and more, he was a bad seed, and no amount of tough love or coddling was going to change who he was at his core. His adoptive mother recalled that he had been a model child until he reached middle school when, seemingly overnight, he turned into a monster she no longer recognized as her son. Defiant, belligerent, and at times violent, her dream child turned into her worst nightmare. Hoping to save him from himself, his parents had pulled him out of public school and enrolled him in a private institution. Determined to choose his own path, Spader, who was now heavily involved in the local drug scene, dropped out. Not quite ready to give up on their son, his parents sent him to a therapist. This gesture, while well-intentioned, did nothing to alter his downward spiral. Even as he kept his family at arm's length, Spader was forming his own support system via a group of social outcasts who were in desperate need of a leader. Against all odds, they found what they were looking for in the former school bully who bragged openly of his desire to kill total strangers for the thrill of watching them die. The band of miscreants, whom Spader dubbed the Disciples of Destruction, consisted of Gribble, Marks, and Glover, with the founder as supreme leader. Followers that they were, the trio of misfits vowed to do as they were instructed or be forever ostracized from the Brotherhood. As part of their initiation into the group, the teenagers had to agree to participate in a home invasion. Not only would they be expected to rob and pillage, but also to kill all the occupants, whether they be men, women, or children. Shockingly, none of them had batted an eye at the prospect of taking innocent lives on Spader's orders. Given their mutual admiration of mass murderers and serial killers, whom they viewed as folk heroes to be emulated, perhaps their willingness to take the lives of others wasn't so surprising after all. While Gribble had been hesitant to admit guilt, at least initially, Spader shared no such qualms. Seeing the writing on the wall, he readily confessed to his role in the murder of Kimberly Cates and the attempted murder of her daughter Jamie. Rather than showing remorse, he had been upset with himself for making the mistake of choosing accomplices whose incompetence in leaving behind a living witness had led to their capture. The evidence mounts. While the suspects were being interviewed, a search was being performed on Gribble's car. Inside the vehicle, deputies found an axe, a box of trash bags, a shovel, gloves, rope, camouflage clothing, and a pawn shop receipt dated for earlier that morning. At the conclusion of the interrogation, Spader was remanded to custody and charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit burglary, and witness tampering. His fellow inmates in the county jail would later tell authorities that Spader had boasted about the attack that decimated the Cates family. Whether his captive audience wanted to hear it or not, he would relive the night of the murder over and over again, making sure to emphasize the number of blows he had administered with the machete, along with his victims' agonized responses. Facing justice. At trial, Marks, Glover, and Savoy testified against Spader in exchange for lighter sentences. On the stand, Glover told the jury that the defendant would often share his fantasies about breaking into a home and slaughtering the occupants. Not only had he wanted to kill them in the most gruesome of fashions, but had allegedly wanted to cook and feast upon their remains, if time allowed. This allegation reaffirmed prosecutor Jeffrey Strelzin's characterization of Spader as a psychopath. Glover, who had fled to the living room and covered his ears to muffle the victim's screams, had been the only one to recoil from the violence that was perpetrated upon the helpless mother and child. Although he was a fan of horror movies and had an interest in serial killers, the reality was far worse than he had imagined. With that said, he had gone along, even after Spader had informed his disciples on the way to the Cates residence that they were about to be party to the evilest thing this town has ever seen. In November of 2010, Spader was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The trial judge, not holding back, told him outright that he belonged in a cage. 2 years later, following changes in the law that negated life without parole for those who committed their offenses as minors, Spader became eligible for a reduced sentence. When the subject was broached, Spader balked. Happy where he was, he refused to cooperate with the appeal process, informing his attorneys that he was the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet. He washed his hands of the proceedings. Moving ahead without him, his legal team applied for the reduction. In the end, Spader received a sentence of life plus 76 years. In 2013, he ordered his attorneys to drop all appeals. Today, he is imprisoned in New Jersey, where he will remain for the duration of his natural life. Glover pleaded guilty to burglary, robbery, and conspiracy to commit burglary, and was sentenced to 20 to 40 years behind bars. His earliest possible release date will be in 2029. William Marks, who observed the vicious attacks on Kimberly and Jamie from the doorway, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit both murder and burglary. For his role in the mayhem, he was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. Marks's father, who had stood by his troubled son through thick and thin, expressed regret for the home invasion and subsequent murder. Even so, he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if William had faced harsher penalties for his previous run-ins with the law. A malcontent who had spurned his parents' attempts to put him on the right path through therapy, the 18-year-old had a dark side that no amount of intervention seemed able to keep at bay. In a poem penned by Marks, he had ominously shared his twisted desires by stating, "I always keep an axe by my side, looking for my next homicide." Hopefully, he will receive the help he needs during the many years he will spend in the custody of the state. Autumn Savoy, who had aided in the cover-up, was ordered to serve 5 to 12 years for hindering apprehension and conspiracy. He was paroled in 2012. As far as anyone knows, presumably having learned his lesson, he has stayed out of trouble. Christopher Gribble, though not the ringleader, is an even more terrifying specimen than Spader, if such a thing is possible. When he faced a judge in March of 2011, he exuded both arrogance and evil from every pore. A devout Mormon who had planned to become a missionary before going another way entirely, he admitted that he had been consumed with thoughts of murder since childhood. The target of his murderous fantasies in those early years was the person he was closest to in the world, his mother. Gribble's built-up hostility toward his mother stemmed from her methods of discipline, which he found to be extreme. According to him, he endured spankings that he believed went too far. As a teenager, he had considered it a form of corporal punishment when his mom would insist on popping the acne on his back. He also complained about such mundane things as having been forced to vacuum the house at a young age. While some might see performing household chores as character building, he viewed it as yet another degrading punishment, dished out by the woman he had grown to despise. In a voice completely devoid of emotion, Gribble related how he wanted to cut pieces off of her and listen to her scream. He also wondered what it would be like to throw her into a vat of boiling water or smother her in sugar and tie her down to a hill of fire ants. Much like the other parents of Spader's motley crew, Gribble's family had taken him to see a psychiatrist to no avail. The so-called expert in her field had brushed it off when her patient confided that he felt he had the potential to become a serial rapist. He also told her of his deep-seated hatred of his parents, especially his mother. He let the therapist know, in no uncertain terms, that he would like to see them dead. Although their son's psychiatrist had shared this information with the Gribbles, she assured them that he was merely blowing off steam. She likened his outbursts to an angry child threatening to kill someone in a fit of temper. In her opinion, he wasn't a danger to himself or others. And with that, Christopher Gribble was given the green light to act on his disturbing thoughts. The victims, however, wouldn't be his long-suffering parents, but rather an innocent young mother and her only child. The devoted follower. A loner who had trouble making friends, Gribble had first met Spader in Boy Scouts. After losing touch, the pair reconnected in 2009, and a symbiotic relationship was forged. Gribble, a follower in need of guidance, and Spader, a natural leader who wanted control over others, were a perfect storm of sinister energy waiting to be unleashed upon the world. Gribble made no secret of the fact that he knew before entering the Cates home that everyone inside was going to die. When the time came for him to spring into action, he had stabbed both Jamie and her mother in calculated strokes, unlike his cohort, who had swung the machete with such wild abandon that his right-hand man had feared becoming yet another casualty before all was said and done. As pompous a defendant as the court had ever seen, Gribble presented himself as a force to be reckoned with, when the very real possibility of spending decades in prison was posed to him. He had smirked and replied that they, meaning the other inmates, have no idea who they're messing with. As it happened, Gribble would soon have to defend his words with actions. At trial's end, he was found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit burglary, and witness tampering. For his crimes, he was sentenced to life without parole. The judge informed him that, had it been within her power, she would have sentenced him to infinity. Gribble appealed his conviction, claiming that he hadn't understood that he had the right to remain silent, even though he had been read his rights more than once and had verbally acknowledged that he understood their meaning. With life in prison looming, he painted himself as a poor soul who had been manipulated by overzealous members of law enforcement. No longer the wiseacre who saw himself as superior to others in every way, Gribble adopted the persona of a half-wit who didn't know the inner workings of the legal system. Even though he had been the one to initiate the confession, he took the position that he had been coerced by deputies. With ample proof to the contrary, including his own voice captured on tape agreeing that he was confessing of his own free will, the appeal was denied. Not nearly as savvy in real life as he was in the fantasy games that had consumed much of his time prior to the murder, Gribble had found out soon enough that thinking you're tough because you stabbed a woman and child as they slept and proving it to hardened criminals were two very different things. Weak-willed and fragile, Gribble quickly became a target of other inmates who, unlike him, could back up their bravado with actions. For his own protection, he was placed in the penitentiary's Special Housing Unit, SHU, where he would spend several years before being integrated into the general population. Once there, he was summarily beaten up by another inmate, forcing officials to send him back to the SHU, where, reminiscent of his childhood, he remains isolated and coddled. Aftermath. Jamie and her father stayed in the home on Trow Road after the attack that left their family in shambles. For their protection, they purchased a guard dog and utilized an alarm system. Though their lives would never be the same, they persevered. In the hopes of ensuring that Kimberly lived on in the community, an annual golf tournament was established in her name. The proceeds of the charity event, which takes place every year on the anniversary of her murder, go toward a scholarship fund set up for local students with their sights set on higher education. Jamie, who is now in her 20s, graduated from college and pursued a career in the healthcare field. A happy, grounded young woman, she has long since moved past the events of that dreadful night when a chapter of her life was closed and another one opened. While she will carry both the physical and emotional scars inflicted by the perpetrators for the rest of her life, she refuses to let them define her. She's a survivor, pure and simple. Kimberly Cates was by all accounts a ray of sunshine that was extinguished much too soon. Outgoing, warm, loving, energetic, and kind, her death was felt throughout the community. A born caregiver without an enemy in the world, she was a victim chosen at random by 4 malcontents with no regard for the lives of others. Chillingly, Gribble had stated in the courtroom that, should he ever be released, he couldn't guarantee that he would never kill again. Let's hope, for society's sake, that we never have to find out. Thanks for watching this video. If you found this story as chilling as I did, please consider subscribing to our channel for more true crime content. And remember, stay safe and vigilant. See you in the next video.